Okay, so what in the world is a Cold War, and how do you fight one? This Powtoon will give you a brief look at the 50-year Cold War that had lots of hotspots and almost led to nuclear war. Let's start with the basics. Who was involved? The Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it was more a war of ideologies, economics, and government. The United States represented democracy, freedom, and capitalism, while the Soviet Union represented communism and socialism. Both sides accused the other of being evil, and both sides were determined to not only spread their beliefs around the world to as many countries as possible in order to rid themselves of their rivals. We could say it all started at the end of World War II, but in reality the conflict between the US and the USSR started during the Russian Civil War, when the US, along with other Western nations, sent troops and supplies to help the White Army defeat Lenin's Red Army and stop the communists from taking control of the government. Fast forward to World War II, where the US and the Soviet Union were unfriendly allies against Hitler. This proves how bad Hitler was. He was able to bring democracy and communism together. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Soviet army occupied Berlin, East Germany, and most of Eastern Europe, and began establishing communist-backed puppet governments in Eastern European nations like Poland. Afraid that communism would spread into a devastated Western Europe, the US and Britain stood firm and made every attempt to stop communism from spreading any further. What we now have is a face-off. Germany was divided into East and West, with the Soviets occupying the East and the US, British, and French occupying the West. What complicated this was the fact that Germany's capital, Berlin, was also divided. West Berlin, located in communist East Germany, would be a free democratic city smack dab in the communist nations. Talk about a complicated and delicate situation. Former Prime Minister Winston Churchill coined the term Iron Curtain in a speech. This described the current state of Europe at the end of the war. This term would last until the end of the Cold War and would reflect the division between a free Europe and a communist Europe. Containment quickly became the U.S. policy in terms of communism in Europe. There was nothing the U.S. could do about communism where it existed without risking a war, but they would not take action to stop it from spreading elsewhere. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, making war with the Russians a very dangerous prospect. The first real threat of the spread of communism beyond its post-war boundaries took place in 1947 in Greece, as communist supporters attempted to take control of the Greek government with the support of Soviet weapons and the Russian Navy. President Harry Truman created what was known as the Truman Doctrine, promising $400 million in military and economic aid to any nation under the threat of a communist takeover. The policy of the United States, he said, is to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. With the help of U.S. money, Turkey and Greece were able to defeat the communist uprisings and remain free and independent of communist control. The U.S. avoided any direct conflict with the Russians and got exactly what they wanted. Seeing the benefit of economic support, Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed a mass U.S. aid package to European nations to help them rebuild following the war. Rebuilding the economies and cities of Europe would help prevent the spread of communism. In total, the United States provided $13 billion in aid between 1948 and 1951. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union rejected the offer of aid, seeing it as an attempt to influence the nations within the Soviet sphere. Over the next 50 years, the Cold War will get hot at times as conflict between the US and the Soviet Union became realistic. Some hot events of the Cold War are Stalin's blockade of West Berlin and the airlift that followed. In 1950, the Korean War began between the US-supported South Korea and the Russian and Communist China-supported North Korea. In 1960, the island of Cuba became a communist nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This put communism in the United States' backyard and gave the Soviet Union a friend on our half of the world. But probably the most dangerous event of the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where in 1962 the United States and the Soviet Union stared down face to face over the installation of Soviet missiles in Cuba and became extremely close to World War III. But the Russians eventually backed out and removed the missiles. And of course the Vietnam War, which lasted from 1959 to 1975, became one of the longest and most controversial wars in American history. The Cold War lasted until 1989 and ended abruptly with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the effects of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union last until today.
Created using Powtoon.